Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and welcome to Book Circle. This time we will continue our reading of Cheerfulness Breaks In by Angela Thurkill. It is all very solitaire et glacé, said Lydia, half to herself. If we are spectres evoquing le passé, said Noel, it is a very nice past. What fun we have had here. Do you remember the picnic on Parsley Island and how dreadful Rose Burkett was? She was ghastly, said Lydia, withdrawing her hand from Noel's as if the spell were broken, but so kind a withdrawal that Noel felt it almost as a caress. And the day Tony and Eric and I cleaned out the pond and Rose threw her engagement ring at Philip. And you had on that dreadful short frock with no sleeves, and all your arms and legs were the color of a beetroot, said Noel. And then Philip dropped the ring into the pool below the pond. I wonder if it is there still. Rose got engaged about 12 times before she married John. If I got engaged, I'd get engaged, said Lydia with a flash of her old arrogance. I think you would, said Noel. And mind, you promise to mention it to me when you do, so I can see if he is good enough. Of course I'll tell you, said Lydia, but I don't think I will at present, because unless it was someone like you, I wouldn't like them enough. Then Noel knew that it was not as a friend that he wanted Lydia to need him. The blow to his heart made it impossible for him to speak for a moment. Divided between a wish to tell Lydia that she was the core of his life and a fear of disturbing her peace, wrenched suddenly by the violence of his own feelings, his self-possession lay shattered. For the first time in his life, he was entirely at a loss. They'd come to the end of the terrace. Lydia, he said as they turned, and on that his foot slipped on the frozen snow, and he would have fallen if Lydia had not supported him with her powerful grasp. Hold up, said Lydia reprovingly. You ought to have nails in your shoes for weather like this, like me. And she turned up the sole of one of her heavy country brogues to show him serried rows of nails. The moment had fled. Lydia said she was frightfully sorry, but she must go to a meeting in the village and would walk as it was so slippery to bicycle. Noel offered to drop her there on his way to Barchester. It's Mrs. Knowles, that stone house with the blue door, said Lydia as they slithered down the village street. Thanks awfully, Noel. Give Octavia my love. Take care of yourself, said Noel, for banalities seemed the only thing to say. I'm more than likely to be at the deanery when I get any leave, and I'll always let you know. Lydia crushed his hand to a jelly and strode up Mrs. Knowles' garden path to the front door, her heart very heavy. The unwanted load lay upon her all that day and for many days, and she found herself entirely unable to account for it. Chapter 14. Dinner at the Deanery. The long winter of everyone's discontent, like a very unpleasant snake, dragged its slow length along. Pipes continued to freeze, burst, and thaw with wearisome regularity. Southbridge School and the Hosier's boys went back to work. Men in their early 20s were summoned away, and men a little older registered. More than half the evacuated children were taken back to London, whence they wrote long letters to their country hostesses expressing a determination to come back and live with them forever as soon as they were old enough. Those children who remained became stouter of body and redder of face every day, and with wearisome regularity had to return to the clinic to have their heads cleaned. Party feeling raged high over this question, the London teachers saying that their children were infected by the cottagers, the local committees asserting that the cottage children were free from any infection until the London children brought it back from town on their visits to their parents. Mrs. and Miss Phelps, taking no notice of either side, cleaned all heads with violent impartiality. The Admiral had the intense pleasure of welcoming Bill and Tubby again as his guests when they returned from a cheerful violation of Norway's highly unneutral waters with their rescued fellow seamen. And when Mrs. Burkett heard that Bill had the ocarina with him on that glorious occasion, she felt that she had in no small measure contributed to the victory and the rescue and became quite bloated with pride. Two outstanding events are to be mentioned in that long, depressing season before early summertime came again. The first was the end of the Gissings, preceded by a crop of rumors which were a perfect godsend to the county. Many people who ought to have known better announced as gospel truth the following perfectly unfounded reports. A. That Mr. Gissing was in the Tower, origin unknown but firmly believed by everyone until the birth of B. That Mr. Gissing was under arrest in the film studios with an armed guard at the door and only allowed to eat boiled eggs into which it is practically impossible to smuggle notes, files, prussic acid, or bombs. Origin, Mrs. Dingle, who cleaned the studios once a week and saw some sandwiches going in and a sham soldier waiting to go on the set for a faked propaganda film who playfully presented a dummy bayonet at her. C. That Mrs. Gissing was under observation by the Secret Service for luring officers to tell her things, unspecified. Origin, Mrs. Phelps, who had been to town for a day's shopping, for once in a coat and skirt, and was taken to lunch at the Café Royal by one of her many naval friends, where she had seen Mrs. Gissing, more dripping with fox and pearls than ever, drinking Pernod with two dark men who looked like soldiers in civilian dress. The Admiral had rounded upon his wife, reminding her that soldiers did not go to the Café Royal in mufti, and she ought to know better. But Mrs. Phelps, who hated Mrs. Gissing without reserve for herself alone, refused to be checked. D. That all the Gissings had been shot. Origin, Mr. Brown of the Red Lion, who, after young Mr. Gissing had been throwing his weight about more than usual in the Red Lion, said he wished they were all put up against a wall. This rumor gained immense credence among all the patrons of the Red Lion, whose faith was untouched by the fact that all the Gissings were seen in the village on the following day. But, as Eileen said, patting her new bubble curls into place with her well-manicured hand, it was easy to dress up like some people, and it stood to reason the government would do things on the quiet, which convinced all but the most hardened unbelievers. E. That young Mr. Gissing had been caught red-handed spying on the railway and was to be deported. Origin, the station master at Tidcombe Halt, who had found young Mr. Gissing traveling to Barchester with a very suspicious tin case which might have been a bomb if it hadn't been film negatives. Young Mr. Gissing had refused to open it and produced his identity card, upon which the station master had said he didn't hold with them things, and they didn't prove nothing, and hauled young Mr. Gissing out of his first-class smoking carriage and locked him into the porter's room while he rang up the police, to whom Mr. Gissing had been so rude, obstructing him in the execution of his duty and threatening actions at law, that his father had had to go and make quite a groveling apology and explanation. After 2 months of such delightful hopes and fears, it was a distinct disappointment to everyone that the Gissing family all went away to America and were not even torpedoed on the way over. When Geraldine heard that they were going, she was afraid that she might mind, but to her great relief she found she didn't, which made her write several very long, dull letters to Captain Fairweather about a trepanning case and a dislocated pelvis. Captain Fairweather rightly interpreted these letters as a proof of love and confidence and carried on with his military duties. The second event, perhaps of less general interest but deeply exciting to our immediate circle at Southbridge, was the publication of Miss Hampton's new novel, Temptation at St. Anthony's, which was chosen as the Anti-Sex Immorality the Anti-Sex Immorality Society Book of the Month in the USA and the Daily Dustbin First Pick for April in England, besides having a more intellectual daily slashing review which sent its sales up by thousands. Miss Hampton had wished to dedicate her book to Mr. and Mrs. Bissell, from whom she said she had learnt many interesting facts hitherto unknown to her, especially from Mrs. Bissell, whose studies in the psychology of educational establishments were as profound as her mind was innocent. But the Bissells, though immensely flattered by the idea, felt that such notoriety might be prejudicial to them in their profession, in which they said one must always consider the weaker members. So Miss Hampton dedicated it to all brave spirits who have been my friends. The Bissells, whose social education had advanced by leaps and bounds during a winter's association with Adelina Cottage, burst into a small sherry party to celebrate the event, particularly inviting Mrs. Morland as a literary light. "It is always," said Mrs. Morland, shaking hands warmly with Miss Hampton, "so difficult when you want to congratulate someone, because you are never sure if they want to be congratulated. But I can't tell you how pleased I am about The Temptation at St. Anthony's. I haven't exactly read it, but I'm just as pleased as if I had, and of course I shall." "I wouldn't if I were you," said Miss Hampton. "Strong meat, not for people with your sensitive outlook." This surprised Mrs. Morland very much, for though she knew that she was no good at being coarse, she had never thought of herself as sensitive, having been for many years far too busy to consider such things. "No, no," continued Miss Hampton. "You and I needn't read each other's books. We write for our public, not for our friends. Mercenaries, you and I. Must say, though, we work for our pay." "Well, that is a great relief," said Mrs. Morland, picking up her gloves, which she had dropped, "because I never expect people, I mean real people, to read my books, and I must say I've never read any of yours, though I'm sure they're frightfully good. It is funny about one's friends. Sometimes one likes the book and not the friend, and sometimes the friend and not the book, and sometimes both or neither. You know George Knox, don't you, who lives near me at High Rising? I'm very fond of him, and I admire his books, though one would never guess they were the same person. But with Mrs. Rivers, I feel exactly the opposite. Not that she is a friend, because I only met her once, years ago, at a lunch party. I don't mean that I admire her and am fond of her books, which would be the exact opposite, but I find them both very unsympathetic. Then there's Mrs. Barton, whose books about Borgias and things are entrancing, but somehow we've never quite hit it off. And I really do like you so much, but I know I wouldn't like your books, so that is perfect." "You're a pretty good sort yourself," said Miss Hampton, giving her tie a jerk. "You had some kind of book of the month once, hadn't you?" "I couldn't help it, really," said Mrs. Morland apologetically, "and it pleased my publisher frightfully. I call it my child of shame." At this simple piece of wit, Miss Hampton laughed uproariously and said she wished she had thought of that. "I'll give it to you," said Mrs. Morland. "I haven't used it much." Mrs. Phelps, who had been listening with deep interest, said she simply couldn't understand how people could write books, but she was always telling Irons he ought to write his life, as he had been pretty well everywhere. She had, she said, found a splendid title for him, Irons in the Fire, because his friends called him Irons, and the fire would mean partly that he had been under fire, and partly that he had a lot of irons in the fire in every sense of the word. Mrs. Morland and Miss Hampton, who had a pretty good idea of what the book would be like, looked at each other with eyes of despair, and said in a jumble of simultaneous speech that it would be perfectly splendid. The Admiral, pleased though modest, said he was only a rough sailor, and all his diaries were lost in that fire at the Pantechnicon while he was at Simpson Town, but he would like to try his hand at it. "You ought to collaborate with Bent, Admiral," said Miss Hampton. "Tell him your idea, Bent." "You know I make a special study of vice, Admiral," said Miss Bent. Miss Phelps said her father was a rear admiral. "Tut, tut," said Miss Bent, to the great admiration of her audience, who had never known those words used outside of a printed book before. "Vice, unnatural vice. Now, Admiral, I would like to pick your brains about the lower deck." This reasonable and scientific request frightened the Admiral so much that only the intervention of Mrs. Bissell kept him from summoning his wife and daughter and going home at once. "Pardon me, Miss Bent," said Mrs. Bissell, "but you have the stick by quite the wrong end, as the saying is. It would be quite useless to ask Admiral Phelps, because his protective or escapist complex would not allow him to open his eyes to social evil. You would do much better to read the chapter on the libido involuntary in A Concept of Neophallic Thought by Spurge Mackworth. He used to lecture at the training college and is a lucid and courageous thinker." "That's very good of you," said Miss Bent, who was sincerely fond of Mrs. Bissell. "But you know my motto, one crowded hour of glorious vice. The Admiral could tell me more in 10 minutes than your friend could in 10 books. But the Admiral could bear it no longer, and took his wife and daughter away to meet some young naval friends who were going to arrive by the 6:40. "It's a pity," said Miss Bent sadly, "when I think of the sidelights you and Mr. Bissell have given us on school psychology. But you must remember, Miss Bent," said Mr. Bissell, "that Mrs. Bissell has made a study of psychology. Of course she can't write fiction, like you ladies, though I often say to her you never know till you've tried, but her knowledge of the subject is very thorough. I assure you the county library simply cannot keep pace with the books she asks for. In February alone she had out 17 books, didn't you, Mother?" Mr. Bissell has omitted to state, said Mrs. Bissell, looking affectionately at her husband, that 2 of them were for Mrs. Dingle. Her husband is apt to be troublesome, and I thought she might get some help. What kind of psychology did you get for her? Asked Mrs. Morland with much interest. Oh, not psychology, said Mrs. Bissell pityingly. That would be quite useless without previous training. I got her a book on curing alcoholism without the patient's knowledge, and another one on elementary jiu-jitsu. She is a well-developed woman in intelligence and physique, and I gather their home life has been quite a different thing. Mrs. Morland then said good-bye, leaving Miss Hampton and Miss Bent to make a night of it with the Bissells, which they did till nearly 8:30, when Miss Bent said they ought to go down to the Red Lion and see who was there. So she and Miss Hampton departed with Mannerheim in tow. As April came on, life altered a little. Oxford came down, and Mrs. Morland left the Burkitts for her own house at High Rising. By an amicable arrangement, her publisher's wife, Sybil Coates, had transferred herself and her nurse and children to her grandmother at Bournemouth for the Easter vacation, so that Mrs. Morland would have her youngest son, Tony, at home with her. Mrs. Morland's new book of short stories came out, and all the reviewers said, "Another vintage Morland," or "Mrs. Morland can be relied upon to give her readers exactly what they expect, and in her new book has given them generous measure, pressed down and overflowing," or "A laugh and a thrill on every page." Mrs. Morland, who never read press notices, was pleased to get her advance on royalties, and felt that Tony's education and the pocket money of her other boys were safe for the present. Her books made no great noise, but her publisher, Adrian Coates, rejoiced in their steady sale and had the great pleasure of finding out through underground channels that a loudly boomed novel called My Burning Flesh, translated from the Mixolydian by a young woman on the staff of the Daily Dustbin and described by his friends and rival publishers Johns and Fairfield as a stark and gripping piece of realism, had only sold half as many copies as Mrs. Morland. Various people in Southbridge, and indeed all over England, were embarrassed by parcels of food from friends or relations in Canada, Australia, the United States, Kenya, and other more or less English-speaking countries. While deeply grateful for the kindness that prompted the dispatch of such parcels to a starvation-haunted England, they were much annoyed by the excessive duty they had to pay, and in several cases wrote to the Times, whose defeatist attitude toward the crossword had by now alienated many of its staunchest supporters. Miss Hampton and Miss Bent had the first serious difference of opinion in a companionship which had lasted for some 20 years. The cause of this rift was the invasion of 2 small and defenseless northern kingdoms, which were thus automatically added to their list of gallant little nations. Not that they differed by a hair's breadth in their hatred and condemnation of the invaders, but the question of moral support from Mannerheim drove them into separate camps. On the chief premise, namely that there was nobody one had ever heard of in Norway or Denmark except Hans Andersen, they were united. But Miss Bent, less impetuous than Miss Hampton, insisted that Norway's claims should be further examined, and to that end took the temporary Mannerheim round to the Bissells one Saturday morning, followed by the protesting Miss Hampton. Mr. and Mrs. Bissell, always delighted by an intellectual discussion, were quickly put in possession of the facts and brought their minds to bear on the question. "I quite see what you mean about Norway," said Mr. Bissell. "One might, of course, mention Nansen." "No," said Miss Bent quite violently. "Look at the trouble the League of Nations has got us into. Besides, Nansen is no name for a dog." With such conviction did she speak that all her hearers felt that if they called a dog Nansen, she would hate it. "Of course there is Longfellow," said Mrs. Bissell. "Longtooth, you mean," said Miss Bent. "No, Longfellow," said Mrs. Bissell placidly. "His beautiful rendering of that fine old saga about King Olaf. I learnt many a canto of it by heart when I was a girl, and I used to teach it to the girls in the 4th standard. Einar then, the arrow taking from the loosened string, answered, 'That is Norway breaking 'neath thy hand, O king.'" This quotation was felt by her audience to be vaguely and uncomfortably too near the mark, given the present state of things, and a depressed silence fell, broken by Mr. Bissell, who said, "Haken." "Hearken, Daddy," said Mrs. Bissell. "Hawken, I think," said Miss Hampton. Miss Bent said she knew one who pronounced it Maeterlinck, but that was perhaps different. "Call him Hagen if you like, Bent," said Miss Hampton, going rather white and sounding suspiciously as if she were going to cry. "You know I only want to please you." At this sudden collapse of Miss Hampton, whom her friends had always taken for the strong and gentlemanly spirit of the pair, the Bissells stood amazed. Mr. Bissell wished he were safely in the master's common room, but Mrs. Bissell, a psychologist first and foremost, quickly recovered her poise and looked on with kind detachment at this interesting practical demonstration of all she had learnt in theory, and suggested a nice cup of tea. Miss Hampton and Miss Bent suddenly knew, as Aurora Fremantle had once discovered, that a nice cup of tea was the one thing in the world worthwhile, and though the Red Lion had been gaping for them for the last half hour, they were glad to accept Mrs. Bissell's offer. Miss Hampton blew her nose violently. Miss Bent said "sorry" in a gruff voice, and after a great deal more discussion on the most amiable terms, it was decided that pending further political moves, Mannheim should be called Anderson. Mrs. Bissell pointing out with her usual excellent common sense that he would probably not hear the difference between the two names, and so answer to his new name much more readily. The ladies then left, happy and reconciled. As they walked down Mariah's little front path, a car drove past. "There's Lydia Keith," said Miss Hampton. "Nice girl. Looks thin lately. Wonder if anything's wrong." "Miss Keith is a very peculiar, and I might say almost abnormal type," said Mrs. Bissell. "How?" said Miss Bent, hoping that Lydia might afford her some sidelights on vice. "She is perfectly normal," said Mrs. Bissell. "Goodbye, Miss Bent. Goodbye, Miss Hampton. Goodbye, Anderson, old fellow." And we will hear a little more about the perfectly normal Lydia and the other folk next time.